Well, hello everybody. Welcome to MUS 351, Ancient, Renaissance, and World Music History. And if you have gotten to this slide, and you are in the right part of the semester and lecture, congratulations. My name is Dr. Claire Federock, and actually, if you want to see what I look like, if you click one more time on this slide, my picture will pop up. And then if you want to hunt me down in the music department, you can actually do that. So we're going to be studying a lot of really cool stuff in this class. Chief on my list is, of course, the ancient cultures and Renaissance, medieval, etc., and how world music all affects all of that. At the bottom of this page, you'll see a great example of an illumination. And what that is a very fancy name for a picture which has been painted by hand and normally has some kind of gold in it or very fancy paints. This is actually an illumination of a chant. The chant is Gaudeamus, and the thing that you're seeing there is actually a G, which has been painted up very fancily and been surrounded by priests and angels and saints. So pretty cool stuff. We'll see a lot of this in this kind of class, and I hope you'll really enjoy it. Just so you guys have a sense of what's going on, this is very heavily lectured, so anything I say will actually be in the notes section of the PowerPoint. If you go out of the PowerPoint and look below the slide, there will be a section for notes. So anything I say, if you happen to miss it as I'm talking, you can always go back and check with the notes. So let's get going. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so here we are at the ancient world. And the first thing I wanted to tell you about is this particular graphic that I have up here. This is actually ancient Greek music and ancient Greek notation for that music, which of course to us is usually non-decipherable, but there are actually two songs on here. And I thought that would be interesting for you to see, considering that we're going to be talking about a lot of this music. So first of all, guys, I want you to consider a discussion question, which perhaps you'll want to think on while we're doing this lecture. How do you believe that the ancient civilizations, such as ancient Greece or ancient Rome, viewed music? Do you think they thought of it as something that was good, or something that was bad, or perhaps a little bit of both? Might be hard to say. Also, a societal question for you guys. What level of society do you believe could afford having music in their homes or hearing music on a regular basis? And how would that affect society? So think about that, and think about how that might compare with our modern world or be very different. So thinking about Greece now, guys, just to be aware that so much of our Western education and world hinges on what the ancient Greek philosophers wrote about music, including people such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And of course, each of them had different ideas about music and different focuses when it came to talking about music. Socrates was very interested in how music affected society and the Republic, and Plato and Aristotle have some other ideas and very specific ideas about music. So you might be aware that, first of all, these three gentlemen all studied with one another, or mentored one another. So the way to remember who came first is the word spa, like a jacuzzi, S-P-A. So it was Socrates who then taught Plato, who then taught Aristotle. One of the first stories about music in ancient Greece that we know of involves the mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras. And we think he was active probably around 500 before Common Era. That's what BCE means, incidentally. You might be aware of Pythagoras because of the Pythagorean theorem. Obviously, he's very well known in the math world, and you'll find out he's also very connected to the music world. A word about this graphic, ladies and gentlemen. This is just a representation of a pottery and telling us a little bit about the instruments of the time. So you have things like the lyra, or the lyre as we know it today, barbitos, kitara, these are all more or less types of harps or plucked instruments. They were very popular in Greece at the time, in case you're wondering about instruments. And we also have one down towards the bottom. It looks almost like a long guitar. And we'll see that that eventually becomes something else that we'll talk about. So, Pythagoras' famous story or myth. According to the disciples of Pythagoras, one day he was walking past a blacksmithy and was very attracted to the ringing notes that he heard when the hammer struck the metal. And very fascinated by that, of course, being a mathematician, he went home and decided he could divide the sounds that he heard into units, which we now call the perfect fifth, bum, bum, the perfect fourth, bum, bum, and the octave, bum, bum. And of course, Pythagoras, being a mathematician, was very curious why it was that these particular sounds were so attractive to his ear. In order to answer that question, he then measured the length of the materials that were being struck and found the amazing solution that there was a ratio of length as related to sound. So in terms of ratios, the fifth is 3 to 2, the fourth is 4 to 3, and the octave, not surprisingly, is 2 to 1. And this, guys, by the way, is the way that we come about the idea that music and math really are interrelated and, in fact, a reflection of one another. You might know several people who are fine musicians that also happen to be very good at arithmetic and mathematical procedures. So we know there's a definite connection in the brain, and Pythagoras was certainly one of the first people to bring about that connection. Compared with Pythagoras' ideas about music and the way that he dealt with it, Plato, or Platonic philosophy, subscribed to a rather different idea. Plato himself was not as concerned about codifying and organizing music as how much it affected the souls and psyches of people that heard it. So, he even said in many of his writings that listening to music excessively, if you're a man, will cause you to become effeminate. And all the gentlemen in this class can now have a good laugh about that and consider if that's actually true or not. It's certainly an interesting point that he makes, the absolute, power that's given to music in his world. So discussion question for you guys to think about is, do you think music can change our moods or change us personally? And ways to think about that might be, if you hear something in a major key, does it make you feel happy? If you hear something in a minor key, does it make you feel sad? And I believe there might be something to this, because the last time I was at Disneyland, I happened to notice that everything is in a major key with tons of modulations for excitement. So I believe Plato was definitely onto something about it affecting our souls and our moods, but you guys may have a different opinion. Moving on to the Greek modes, that's actually what our graphic is about on this slide. These are some of the different modes, Dorian, Hypodorian, Phrygian, etc. And if you're feeling like getting real down and dirty, make sure you play these on the piano, because it's very interesting to hear them. Definitely sound different than our modern major and minor scales. So the Greeks used modes in their music. And Plato says specifically that these modes are a collection of pitches in specific intervals, much like our modern scales, and they were also a way of manipulating the listener's emotions. In Greece, there were specific modes that were used at specific times of day and had very strong associations with certain emotions. Certain modes were played right before one was about to go into battle. Others were played when they were intended to calm a person down. And one story, in fact, or myth, I should say, that demonstrates the power of the modes actually involves the rape of a young woman, or the almost rape of a young woman. There was apparently a young woman in Greece who was in that situation, and a passerby who was playing something on a lyre happened to play something in the Lydian mode, and apparently the rapist stopped what he was doing and suddenly became calm and docile. Now, you may say that couldn't possibly be true, but it certainly does let us know the power that was ascribed to music, and especially to the modes, by the Greeks. And incidentally, in case you're wondering about these different names, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, etc., these were actually taken from the Greek tribes that used these modes. And in fact, in the medieval period, which comes, of course, after the ancient world, they don't use these names. These names were rediscovered by a Renaissance scholar, and he renamed the modes. But in the medieval period, they in fact used numbers to designate different modes. So we'll be talking about modes in that way, as they did. So as you guys can see, Plato is a bit leery of music because of its great power, and he feels that one must be very, very careful with it so that you don't become crazy or violent. In comparison to Plato, Aristotle has a bit of a different philosophy of music, and he doesn't see music as being quite as dangerous as Plato seems to think it is. Aristotle, however, does give us what becomes a cornerstone of Christian philosophy, and that is that everyone should receive a certain amount of music education, learn to play an instrument a bit, and know some of the modes. And that sounds pretty common actually today in our own society. Many parents struggle as to whether they should sign their kids up for soccer or sign them up for piano lessons. So that's a good example of that. The difference here is that Aristotle believed one should stop after learning some music. One should not become a professional musician, because in ancient Greek society, professional musicians were seen on the same level as prostitutes and other entertainers of society. And if you think about it, music and entertainment are often linked in that manner, even today. If I think about, for example, as late as the 20th century, the Japanese geishas of Japan, who were, of course, very high-class courtesans, but were also extremely accomplished musicians and dancers. So that's part of Greek society that one might not think would be true, but is. So now that we've looked a bit at ancient Greece, let's take a look at ancient Rome. And you can see there's a lovely gentleman with a laurel on his head, of course to remind us of the great Olympics, and also playing a very interesting looking trumpet, almost. So there's a good graphic for you guys to consider. Ancient Rome is a bit different than Greece. Part of the reason for that is that they are a bit more like Pythagoras. They want to come up with a designation for everything, and they're exceptionally logical. And they're also highly motivated about education. So they organize education into what are called the 7 liberal arts, and then they further designate those into 2 groups called the trivium and the quadrivium. And the trivium was the way in which most Roman citizens would learn to read and write, and they would use things such as logic to debate, grammar to put words together, and rhetoric as well. Rhetoric is a very studied practice of trying to move your listener or your audience to feel a certain way. I would say people that use it nowadays are pastors with the congregation and lawyers in the courtroom and musical performers of all sorts. Then moving on to the quadrivium, that has to do with the use and practice of mathematics. And that contained the following 4 items: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And I find it interesting to note that music is put here because many of us today think of music as an art instead of a science, which I suppose it would be considered more of a science than a math in this case. So not where we might place it today. However, the Romans conquered the Greeks, read all about what Pythagoras had discovered at the blacksmithy, and therefore put music into the mathematical category. No discussion of Rome would be complete unless I mentioned a Roman philosopher to go with our Greek philosophers. So here, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be talking about Boethius for just a moment, who was a Roman scholar and mathematician. Again, there's that connection with math and music. And we believe he was active between about 480 through 524 Common Era. It's sometimes difficult to date births and deaths during this time because there's just not a lot of documentation about people. It's only what they wrote that we have, and we can somewhat date that. So, Boethius being a Roman, wants to organize music and codify it, and he finds a way to do that into three different types of music. The first is called musica mundana, and that is the music of the spheres and the universe. So the ancients were aware of planets and the heavens, and they felt that when all was right and all the planets were revolving the way they were supposed to, a divine music and divine harmony was created out of that. And isn't that a lovely thought? I've always really enjoyed this concept myself. The next type of music is called musica umana, which is on a smaller scale, but like the music of the spheres, this refers to the music of the human body. The human body as a divine mechanism which is perfectly constructed in divine harmony when everything is balanced and all the humors are correct, etc. Then there's divine music called musica humana. The last type that Boethius mentions is musica instrumentalis, and this is the type that we'll be dealing with for all practical purposes in this class, music which can be heard and played aloud on instruments. The other two you wouldn't necessarily hear, you would simply be aware of as a philosophical idea, and perhaps you could feel them. So as you can see, guys, Romans have in general a more clinical approach to music than the Greeks do. But they borrow several things from Greek society, which of course they've conquered and then taken many ideas from. So the Romans still believe that music fills up everything in the universe. However, like the Greeks, they take a cautious approach to music because of its power, and they fully believe in the power of the modes and that they have an immediate connection to our souls and psyches. So that idea of emotionalism in music is something that Christianity really picks up on when it comes into being in Western Europe. And the whole idea of using music in a worship setting is intended to bring emotion and piety and deep contemplation to all the members of the congregation. Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, this graphic that I have up here is in fact a portrayal of Boethius in a medieval manuscript, and he is talking about the divine idea of music of the spheres. You can see that by the spherical component there by his hand. Another discussion question for you, ladies and gentlemen, to consider as we go through this course. What period are we talking about when we use the term Middle Ages? And since you're in this course, I obviously don't expect you to know everything before you take it, but do consider, when do you think of the Middle Ages or the medieval period as beginning and ending? And what does that term Middle Ages, what does that really mean? Well, I can help you out with some of that. That term Middle Ages, in fact, refers to the time immediately after the old Roman Empire ends. So, end of the Roman Empire, and then everyone presumed there would be something better to come afterwards. But the time in between the Roman Empire ending and then that better thing that was to come is often referred to as the Middle Ages, because it's in between. These are also sometimes called the Dark Ages, and there are good reasons for that, actually. This is a time without law and without order, and much of what does exist for law and order is rather entrepreneurial. If you think about the Sheriff of Nottingham, for example, there's also an inordinate amount of ignorance and injustice, as well as crime and barbarism. So there are some pretty awful things that happen during this time. And then there's some pretty great things that happen as well, which we'll be talking about. As far as a date for when this actually occurs, the beginning of the Middle Ages, many people have placed it between the years 500 and 1054. So there's a lot of different ideas about when it starts and why that is. But for us in this class, we are going to date the beginning of the Middle Ages as being the year 476 Common Era, because this is the date at which the Roman Empire falls. The Roman Empire encompassed an enormous amount of territory. there was an eastern half and a western half. And when I was dating the fall of Rome, the half of the Roman Empire that falls is the one in the west. The last Roman emperor is deposed by barbarians who were called Visigoths, and they were from Germany. And guys, also wanted to let you know, when we hear the word barbarian, we tend to think of big guys with clubs who are probably not that smart. And in fact, barbarians in this time period are highly organized, almost franchised, and have a pretty elaborate communication system. So don't think of them as being all that dumb, because they managed to conquer enormous amounts of territory with their barbarism. At any rate, it may not have been that difficult for them to actually depose this emperor, as he was a semi-retarded young boy. But that's what they did, and that's when the Middle Ages begin. Now, as far as when they end, we should date the end of the Middle Ages, probably for music at least, during the 1400s. Many people in the arts and sciences might say the 1300s and give you an earlier date, because their developments are being made a little bit sooner than those in music. And to just let you guys know a little bit more about what I said earlier, things in the Middle Ages or Dark Ages are not always backwards and in a state of disarray. There are great periods of intellectual and technological development. Small things that we might not think of, such as harnesses on horses being developed, the cultivation of land, the cultivation of trade routes. These things are enormously important, because many of the great established trade routes and government that Rome had come up with had fallen to disrepair. So when people start to pick up the slack, it really is a big deal. Another element that's important, the Crusades, which you guys might be familiar with, the wars between Christianity and Islam for Jerusalem during this time. They bring Western Europe in touch with the Arabs, and this really allows for a great amount of information exchange. Many scientific discoveries that have been made by the Arabs come to be known by Western Europe, and truly, the West only began to understand classical learning, that of ancient Greece and Rome, by retranslating Arab treatises on the subject. So they knew about it, Rome knew about it, and then Rome dies a miserable death, and they have to rediscover it. So, also another question for you guys to consider for discussion. When you think of the Middle Ages, what kind of images come to mind? And they don't all have to do with music. So many classes of mine have come up with lots of different things to say on the subject, but a few things, just to let you know, that have happened in the past. People have mentioned the idea of class separation, and that's a very good point, because in the Middle Ages there is the noble class and then there are the peasants. There ain't no middle class the way there is in America today. The church, of course, which sort of pervades all human existence, and we'll see exactly how that happens. The concept of chivalry and knights and the code of ethics that they followed, which sometimes wasn't very ethical, and we'll find out more about that as well. Cultural exchange and cultural isolation. Imagine being in Western Europe at this time, which is very, very barbaric. The monks, that's something else that everyone thinks of, monks wearing robes and singing Gregorian chant. The Black Death, or the Plague, is another big one for a lot of people. And there's actually a lot of speculation about the plague and what it really was, and there's still some argument about that. Some people actually today think it may have been a form of mad cow disease, and that folks ate the meat, which was already mad cow, and then they became mad themselves. Then there's the other solution, which says that the bubonic plague, which was carried by fleas that were on infected rats, and that there were so many rats during this time because people were highly superstitious and would kill pretty much any cat they came across, whether it was black or not, because they thought they were seeing the devil. So cat population goes down, rat population goes up, and flea population skyrockets, and that could be another reason for the plague. The feudal system, owing fealty to a lord or a king, and we will discuss that in another lecture. So thank you guys for hanging in here with me in this first lecture. Hope it all made sense, and look forward to hearing from you in threaded discussion. Thanks.